In the depths of human suffering, pride becomes both armor and prison. When elite warriors fall, they often refuse the very help that could save them, clinging to their training that whispers never show weakness. But sometimes in the darkest moments, a single word spoken by an unlikely savior can shatter every wall built by years of conditioning. This is the story of Commander Sarah Mitchell, a decorated Navy SEAL whose world collapsed in a single moment of enemy fire, and Private Emma Rodriguez, a rookie Marine whose quiet observation would unlock a secret that could either destroy or redeem them both. What happens when the strongest among us must learn to accept help from those we least expect? When survival depends not on individual strength but on the courage to trust? In the unforgiving landscape where honor meets vulnerability, some battles can only be won by surrendering. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountainside as Commander Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical gear one final time. At 34, she had earned every scar that marked her weathered hands, every commendation that decorated her service record. 15 years in the Navy SEALs had transformed her from an uncertain recruit into one of the most respected operators in her unit. Her teammates called her ice, not because she was cold, but because nothing seemed to crack her composure under pressure. Sarah's unit had been tasked with a reconnaissance mission deep in Taliban territory. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was moving through the region, and her team needed to gather information without engaging. It should have been routine for operators of their caliber. Sarah had run countless missions like this, slipping through enemy territory like ghosts, gathering intelligence, and disappearing before anyone knew they were there. The team moved through the rocky terrain with practiced silence. Sarah took point, her eyes constantly scanning for threats while her team followed in perfect formation behind her. Each member knew their role without needing words. They had trained together for 3 years, becoming more than teammates. They were brothers and sisters bound by shared danger and absolute trust. As they approached the target location, Sarah raised her fist, signaling the team to halt. Through her binoculars, she could see movement in the valley below. A convoy of vehicles had stopped near a small village, and armed men were unloading equipment. This was more than the intelligence reports had suggested. What they thought was a simple passage had turned into something much larger. Sarah made the decision to get closer for better surveillance. She signaled her team to hold position while she moved down the slope alone. Years of training had taught her to trust her instincts, and something about the scene below felt wrong. The number of fighters, their equipment, the way they moved, it all suggested this was more significant than their briefing had indicated. Moving carefully from rock to rock, Sarah worked her way down the mountainside. She needed clear photos of the faces in the convoy, documentation of their weapons and vehicles. This intelligence could save lives if it revealed a larger operation and planning. The mission requirements were clear. Observe and report, avoid engagement at all costs. She found a perfect position behind a cluster of boulders about 200 meters from the convoy. Through her scope, she could see the faces of the men clearly. Some she recognized from intelligence briefings. These were high-level operatives, not the local fighters they had expected to encounter. Her training told her to document everything and withdraw immediately. Sarah began taking photographs, her camera clicking quietly as she captured face after face. The intelligence value of these images would be enormous. Her team leader would be pleased with the quality of information they were gathering. But as she focused on her work, Sarah failed to notice the young boy herding goats on the hillside above her position. The boy had spotted the strange figure moving among the rocks. In a region where any unknown person could be dangerous, he did what his village had taught him. He raised an alarm. His shouts echoed across the valley, immediately alerting the convoy below. Sarah cursed under her breath as she saw heads turning in her direction, weapons being raised. Her position was compromised. Years of training kicked in as Sarah began her withdrawal, moving quickly but carefully back up the slope toward her team. She could hear voices shouting in the valley below, the sound of engines starting. They had been discovered, and now the mission had changed from reconnaissance to escape and evasion. Sarah was halfway back to her team's position when the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock next to her head, sending stone fragments across her face. More shots followed as the enemy fighters began their pursuit up the mountainside. Sarah's training took over as she moved from cover to cover, returning fire only when necessary to keep her pursuers at bay. Her team heard the gunfire and immediately moved to support her withdrawal. Over her radio, she could hear her team leader coordinating their extraction while calling for air support. But in the remote mountain region, help was at least 30 minutes away. They needed to hold their position and fight their way out. Sarah reached a small ledge and took cover behind a fallen tree. Below her, she could see at least a dozen fighters making their way up the slope. More were flanking around both sides, trying to surround her position. She was outnumbered and outgunned, but her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. She began engaging targets methodically, using her superior marksmanship to thin out the advancing force. Each shot was calculated, each movement designed to maintain her advantage while conserving ammunition. Her teammates were moving to support her, but they were still several minutes away from her position. The enemy fighters were closer now, their automatic weapons sending streams of bullets past Sarah's position. She could hear them coordinating their attack, trying to pin her down, while others moved to better positions. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Sarah remained calm, trusting in her training and the knowledge that her team was coming. As she prepared to move to a new position, Sarah heard the distinctive whistle of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. Her training kicked in as she threw herself to the ground. But the explosion was too close. The blast lifted her from the ledge and sent her tumbling down the rocky slope, her gears scattering as she fell. When Sarah came to consciousness, she was lying among the rocks at the bottom of a small ravine. Her left leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and blood was seeping through her uniform in several places. But it was the shooting pain in her spine that told her the real extent of her injuries. She tried to move and felt nothing below her waist. The sound of approaching voices brought Sarah back to immediate awareness. The enemy fighters were searching for her, getting closer with each passing minute. She tried to reach for her weapon but found her rifle had been thrown beyond her reach in the fall. Her sidearm was still holstered, but drawing it required movement that sent waves of agony through her body. Sarah's training had covered this scenario countless times. An injured operator behind enemy lines had limited options, none of them good. She could try to evade capture, call for extraction, or make a final stand. But with her current injuries, movement was nearly impossible, and her radio had been damaged in the fall. As the voices grew closer, Sarah made peace with what seemed inevitable. She had lived her entire adult life in service to her country, and if this was where that service ended, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through 15 years of dangerous missions. Her only regret was that her team would blame themselves for not reaching her in time. The first enemy fighter appeared at the edge of the ravine, his weapon trained on Sarah's position. She could see others moving to surround her location. They shouted at her in their language, demanding she surrender her weapons. Sarah understood enough to know they wanted her alive, which meant interrogation and eventual execution. Using every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah managed to draw her sidearm. The movement sent lightning bolts of pain through her damaged spine, but she forced herself to maintain focus. If this was her final moment, she would meet it on her own terms, as a warrior should. But before she could raise her weapon, the distinctive sound of American helicopters filled the air. Her team had managed to call in air support faster than expected. The enemy fighters scattered as the aircraft approached, abandoning their prize to avoid the devastating firepower now bearing down on them. Within minutes, a rescue helicopter was hovering over Sarah's position. Medics rappelled down to her location while attack helicopters provided cover fire. The professional competence of the rescue team was everything Sarah had expected, but as they began working on her injuries, the extent of her condition became clear. The lead medic, a seasoned combat veteran, worked quickly to stabilize Sarah's condition. But even as he administered pain medication and secured her injuries for transport, Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. The damage to her spine was severe, and her legs showed no response to any stimulus. As they lifted Sarah into the helicopter, she maintained her composure despite the devastating implications of her injuries. Her SEAL training had taught her to accept what could not be changed and focus on what could be controlled. But deep inside, she knew her life as she had known it was over. The flight to the medical facility passed in a haze of pain medication and medical procedures. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as the medical team worked to keep her stable. In her lucid moments, she found herself thinking not about her injuries but about how she would face whatever came next with the same honor that had defined her service. When Sarah finally arrived at the advanced medical facility, a team of specialists was waiting. The next few hours would determine not just her survival, but what kind of life she might have beyond her injuries. As she was wheeled into surgery, Commander Sarah Mitchell, the warrior who had never shown weakness, was about to face the greatest battle of her life, learning to live with limitations she had never imagined possible. The surgery lasted 8 hours. When Sarah woke up, she found herself in a clean, white hospital room surrounded by machines monitoring her vital signs. The doctor was reviewing her chart at the foot of her bed, his expression grave. As consciousness fully returned, Sarah tried to move her legs and felt nothing. The paralysis that had begun with her fall was now confirmed as permanent. Dr. Reynolds, the chief of neurosurgery, approached Sarah's bed with the careful manner of someone who had delivered difficult news many times before. He explained the extent of her injuries in clinical terms that Sarah understood all too well. The damage to her spinal cord was complete and irreversible. She would never walk again. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Mitchell felt something crack inside her chest. Not her bones or her body, but something deeper, the absolute certainty that had carried her through every challenge she had ever faced. As the doctor continued explaining her prognosis and treatment options, Sarah found herself nodding and asking appropriate questions, but inside she was falling into a darkness deeper than any she had experienced in combat. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of medical procedures, physical therapy evaluations, and visits from superior officers expressing their regret and gratitude for her service. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor through all of it, answering questions, following medical advice, and behaving exactly as everyone expected a wounded warrior should behave. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had broken in Sarah Mitchell. The identity that had defined her for 15 years, elite warrior, protector, someone who could handle any challenge, had been shattered as completely as her spine. She was now something she had never imagined being, dependent, limited, and in need of help she had never thought she would require. As the medical team prepared Sarah for transfer to a long-term rehabilitation facility, she made a decision that would define the next phase of her life. She would accept the medical care necessary for her physical survival, but she would not accept help beyond that. She would not become someone else's burden or project. If she could no longer be the warrior she had always been, she would at least maintain her independence and dignity. Commander Sarah Mitchell was about to learn that sometimes the hardest battles are fought not against external enemies, but against the walls we build to protect ourselves from a world that has suddenly become too dangerous to trust. The rehabilitation facility at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a place dedicated to healing the unhealable. Sarah wheeled herself through the corridors for the first time, her strong arms already adapting to the mechanics of her new reality. 3 weeks had passed since her injury, and the doctors declared her stable enough for the intensive rehabilitation process that would determine her future quality of life. Sarah had requested a private room, citing her rank and need for security briefings that would never come. In truth, she could not bear the thought of sharing her vulnerability with another wounded warrior. The other patients she passed in the hallways, amputees learning to walk with prosthetics, burn victims working through painful skin grafts, soldiers dealing with traumatic brain injuries, represented a community she was not ready to join.
Her physical therapist, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had worked with hundreds of spinal cord patients during her 8 years at the facility.
She recognized the signs immediately when Sarah arrived for their first session. The rigid posture, the clipped responses to questions, the way Sarah's eyes focused on everything except the other patients working around them. Pride, Captain Walsh knew, could be more crippling than any physical injury. During their initial assessment, Sarah demonstrated the upper body strength that had made her an elite operator. Her arms and core were still powerful, her reflexes sharp, her determination evident in every movement. But when Captain Walsh suggested group therapy sessions or activities with other patients, Sarah's refusal was absolute and non-negotiable. Each day followed the same pattern. Sarah would arrive for her scheduled therapy sessions exactly on time, work with mechanical precision through every exercise, and return to her room without engaging with anyone beyond the minimum required for her treatment. She declined visits from her former teammates, refused interviews from military publications, and ignored the stack of cards and letters from supporters around the world. Her former team leader, Master Chief Thompson, made multiple attempts to visit. He had served with Sarah for 5 years and understood her better than most. But each time he appeared at her door, Sarah found reasons to send him away. She was too tired, had medical appointments, or simply wasn't ready for visitors. The man who had trusted her with his life in dozens of combat situations was now held at arm's length by the invisible barriers Sarah had constructed around herself. The medical staff began to notice concerning patterns in Sarah's behavior. She ate alone in her room rather than joining other patients in the dining facility. She refused participation in recreational activities designed to help patients adjust to their new circumstances. Most troubling of all, she showed no interest in learning about adaptive technologies or lifestyle modifications that could significantly improve her independence. Dr. Patricia Kovac, the facility's chief psychologist, attempted to engage Sarah in counseling sessions. Having worked with combat veterans for over a decade, she recognized the complex grief that accompanied life-altering injuries. But Sarah approached these sessions with the same mechanical compliance she brought to physical therapy, answering questions precisely while revealing nothing of her internal struggle. During one session, Dr. Kovac asked Sarah about her plans for the future. For the first time, Sarah's composure, cracked slightly. She had no plans beyond completing the minimum rehabilitation required for discharge. The career that had defined her identity was over, and she had not yet imagined what might take its place. The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, acrid and uncomfortable. As weeks passed, Sarah's physical progress was remarkable. Her upper body strength returned to near pre-injury levels. She mastered her wheelchair with the precision she had once applied to weapons handling, and she learned to navigate various environments with increasing skill. But emotionally, she seemed to be moving backward rather than forward, becoming more isolated and withdrawn with each passing day. The breaking point came during a routine physical therapy session. Sarah was working on transfer techniques, learning to move from her wheelchair to various surfaces independently. The exercise required her to trust the stability of her upper body while her legs, secured with straps, provided no assistance. As she attempted a particularly challenging transfer to a raised mat, Sarah lost her balance and fell. The fall was minor. Dr. Walsh had positioned herself to catch patients who lost their balance, but for Sarah, it represented everything she hated about her new reality. She was no longer in complete control of her body, no longer able to trust her instincts and training to keep her safe. As Captain Walsh helped her back into position, Sarah's frustration boiled over into anger. She snapped at Captain Walsh with a harshness that surprised them both, questioning the value of exercises that only highlighted her limitations. Why learn to transfer to a mat when she would never again rappel from a helicopter? Why master wheelchair navigation when she would never again move silently through enemy territory? The questions came out in a torrent of pain and frustration that had been building for weeks. Captain Walsh, who had weathered similar outbursts from dozens of patients, remained calm and professional. She had learned that anger was often the first sign that a patient was beginning to process their loss rather than simply enduring it. But she also recognized that Sarah's isolation was preventing the emotional healing necessary for successful rehabilitation. That evening, Sarah sat in her room staring out the window at the parking lot below. She watched able-bodied visitors coming and going, living lives that seemed impossibly normal and carefree. A year ago, she had been preparing for another deployment, focused on mission planning and equipment checks. Now she struggled to imagine what her life might look like even 6 months in the future. The knock on her door interrupted her brooding. Sarah expected another well-meaning staff member, but instead found herself facing Private Emma Rodriguez, a young Marine who had been assigned to the facility's support staff while recovering from her own injuries. Emma had lost 3 fingers on her left hand to an improvised explosive device, but her injury was minor compared to most patients at the facility. Emma had been assigned to deliver meal trays to patients who preferred eating in their rooms. Over the past 2 weeks, she had quietly observed Sarah's isolation and recognized something familiar in the older woman's behavior. As someone who had also struggled with accepting help after her injury, Emma understood the pride that kept Sarah locked away from the community around her. During their brief interactions, Emma had noticed details that others missed. The way Sarah's jaw tightened when other patients laughed together in the hallways, how her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. The careful way she positioned her wheelchair so that her legs were always covered with a blanket. Emma recognized the signs of someone drowning in their own pride. Emma had grown up in a family where showing weakness was not tolerated. Her father, a former Marine himself, had raised her to believe that accepting help was the same as admitting defeat. When she first arrived at the facility, she had been as isolated and angry as Sarah, refusing assistance and alienating everyone who tried to help her. It had taken a conversation with an unlikely mentor to change her perspective. The mentor had been Master Sergeant James Mitchell, a triple amputee who had lost both legs and an arm to a roadside bomb in Iraq. Despite his devastating injuries, Sergeant Mitchell had become one of the most positive influences at the facility, helping other patients navigate their darkest moments with a combination of dark humor and hard-earned wisdom. He had seen something in Emma that she had not seen in herself. Sergeant Mitchell had told Emma about his own journey from bitter isolation to acceptance and purpose. He had explained that strength was not about never needing help, but about having the courage to accept help when it was offered. More importantly, he had helped Emma understand that her value as a person was not diminished by her physical limitations. The conversation that changed Emma's perspective had not come through formal counseling or group therapy. Instead, it had happened during a quiet moment when Sergeant Mitchell had shared something deeply personal about his own darkest period after his injuries. He had told Emma about the night he had considered ending his own life, because he could not imagine living as anything less than the warrior he had always been. Sergeant Mitchell had survived that night because he finally accepted help from an unexpected source. A fellow patient, a young soldier who had lost an eye to shrapnel. had noticed his distress and simply sat with him through the long hours until dawn. No profound words were exchanged, no dramatic interventions occurred, but the simple presence of someone who understood had been enough to carry him through the crisis. Now, as Emma stood in Sarah's doorway, she carried with her the memory of that lesson and the hope that she might be able to offer Sarah the same kind of quiet support that had saved Sergeant Mitchell's life. She had no grand plan or special training, just the recognition of shared pain and the belief that isolation was more dangerous than any physical enemy they had faced in combat. Emma asked permission to enter Sarah's room, not to deliver a meal or complete an assignment, but simply to talk. Sarah's first instinct was to decline, to maintain the barriers that had protected her from unwanted sympathy and uncomfortable questions. But something in Emma's manner, the absence of pity, the directness of her approach, made Sarah curious enough to agree. Emma sat down in the chair across from Sarah's wheelchair and began talking about her own injury and recovery process. She did not offer advice or try to minimize Sarah's situation. Instead, she simply shared her own story, describing the anger and fear that had consumed her during her early days at the facility. She talked about the shame she had felt at needing help with basic tasks and the way her identity as a Marine had seemed to crumble along with her damaged hand. As Emma spoke, Sarah found herself listening with an attention she had not given to anyone since her injury. Here was someone who understood the specific kind of loss that came with military injury. Not just the physical damage, but the shattering of an identity built around competence and self-reliance. Emma's words carried the weight of lived experience, rather than clinical training or well-meaning sympathy. Emma described her gradual realization that accepting help was not the same as giving up, and that her value as a person extended far beyond her physical capabilities. She talked about the other patients who had influenced her recovery, each bringing their own perspective on surviving devastating change. Most importantly, she shared how learning to help others had become a source of strength and purpose that her previous military service had not provided. The conversation lasted over an hour, with Sarah asking questions for the first time since her arrival at the facility. She wanted to know how Emma had moved past the anger, how she had learned to envision a future different from the one she had planned, how she had found the courage to trust others with her vulnerability. Emma answered each question honestly, acknowledging that the process was ongoing and imperfect. As their conversation wound down, Emma mentioned something that caught Sarah's attention. She talked about a group of patients who had formed an informal support network at the facility. They met irregularly, sometimes in the recreation room, sometimes outdoors when weather permitted. The group had no formal structure or agenda. They simply provided a space where wounded warriors could speak honestly about their struggles without judgment or pressure to maintain a brave face. Emma did not invite Sarah to join the group or suggest that she should consider participating. Instead, she simply mentioned that the group existed and that they welcomed anyone who wanted to join them. She left Sarah with the information and her own phone number, suggesting that Sarah could contact her if she ever wanted to continue their conversation. After Emma left, Sarah sat alone in her room processing their conversation. For the first time since her injury, she had spoken honestly about her fears and anger, without feeling judged or pitied. Emma's presence had been comfortable in a way that no medical professional or military colleague had managed to achieve. Perhaps most importantly, Emma had demonstrated that it was possible to maintain dignity and purpose despite physical limitations. That night, Sarah slept better than she had in weeks. The conversation with Emma had not solved her problems or erased her grief, but it had opened a small crack in the wall of isolation she had built around herself. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that her life might still have meaning and purpose, even if it looked very different from what she had planned. The next morning, Sarah's approach to her therapy sessions was subtly different. She still worked with the same mechanical precision, but she asked more questions about the techniques she was learning. Captain Walsh noticed the change immediately and began incorporating more challenging exercises that would prepare Sarah for greater independence. The shift was small but significant. Sarah was beginning to engage with her rehabilitation rather than simply enduring it. Over the following days, Sarah found herself paying more attention to the other patients at the facility. She began to notice the camaraderie between some of them, the way they encouraged each other through difficult exercises, the humor they used to cope with their circumstances. She was not yet ready to join their community, but she was no longer actively avoiding acknowledgement of their existence. Emma continued her regular duties at the facility, but she and Sarah had established a pattern of brief conversations during meal deliveries. These exchanges were casual and unforced, covering topics ranging from military experiences to favorite books, to observations about life at the rehabilitation center. Emma never pushed for deeper conversation, but she remained available whenever Sarah seemed ready to talk. The foundation for Sarah's eventual breakthrough was being laid through these small, consistent interactions. Emma's approach, patient, respectful, and grounded in shared experience, was creating a safe space where Sarah could begin to lower her defenses without feeling that her dignity was under assault. Neither woman realized they were preparing for a moment that would change both of their lives forever. A moment that would require Emma to share a secret she had never told anyone, and Sarah to make a choice about who she wanted to become in this new phase of her life. The thunderstorm that rolled through Washington, D.C. that evening seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions building within the walls of Walter Reed. Sarah had been at the facility for 6 weeks now, and while her physical recovery had exceeded all expectations, her emotional healing remained stalled behind walls of pride and fear. The rain hammered against her window as she worked through paperwork related to her disability evaluation, each form a reminder of how dramatically her life had changed. Earlier that day, Sarah had received news that shattered what remained of her composure. Her former team was deploying without her for the first time in 5 years. Master Chief Thompson had called personally to inform her, his voice heavy with the weight of leaving a teammate behind. He assured her that her tactical knowledge had been invaluable in their mission planning, but they both knew the truth. She was no longer part of the brotherhood that had defined her existence. After the call, Sarah had retreated to her room, and for the first time since her injury, she had allowed herself to cry. Not the controlled grief she had shown Dr. Kobach during counseling sessions, but the raw, devastating sobs of someone confronting the full reality of their loss. She had lost more than the use of her legs. She had lost her identity, her purpose, and her place in the community that had been her family for 15 years. Emma arrived for her evening meal delivery to find Sarah in this broken state. The proud warrior who had maintained perfect composure through weeks of painful rehabilitation was finally allowing her grief to show. Emma set down the meal tray and quietly closed the door, recognizing that Sarah needed privacy for this moment of vulnerability. But as Emma turned to leave, Sarah's voice stopped her. Through her tears, Sarah asked Emma to stay. The request was barely audible, but it carried the weight of desperation. For the first time since her injury, Sarah was actively asking for human connection rather than simply enduring it. Emma understood the significance of the moment and settled into the chair she had occupied during their previous conversations. Sarah struggled to explain what had triggered her breakdown. Between broken sentences, she described the phone call from her team leader and the devastating realization that life was continuing without her. She talked about feeling forgotten, useless, and lost in a way that no enemy fire had ever made her feel. The words came out in fragments, interrupted by fresh waves of grief that had been building for weeks. Emma listened without offering advice or empty reassurance. She had learned from her own experience that sometimes the most helpful thing was simply to witness someone's pain without trying to fix it. Sarah needed to feel heard and understood, not coached or counseled. Emma's presence was steady and patient, providing the safety Sarah needed to finally release the emotion she had been suppressing. As Sarah's tears gradually subsided, she found herself talking more openly than she had since her injury. She described her fears about the future, her anger at her helplessness, and her shame at needing assistance with tasks she had once performed without thought. She talked about the nightmares that visited her sleep, not about combat, but about being a burden on others and losing her independence completely. Emma shared her own darkest moments during recovery, describing nights when she had stared at the ceiling wondering if her life still had any meaning. She talked about the specific pain of watching her former unit continue their mission while she learned to adapt to civilian life with a permanent disability. The parallel experiences created a bridge of understanding between them that no amount of professional counseling had achieved. During their conversation, Sarah mentioned something that caught Emma's attention. She described a recurring dream where she was trying to call for help using military communication protocols, but no one could understand her transmissions. The dream always ended with Sarah alone, on a battlefield surrounded by static and unable to make contact with friendly forces. Emma recognized the dream as more than random anxiety. It represented Sarah's fear of being cut off from the military community that had been her entire world. Emma asked Sarah about her military communications training, curious about the specific protocols that appeared in her dreams. Sarah described the complex systems Navy SEALs use to maintain contact during operations, the backup frequencies and emergency codes that could mean the difference between life and death in hostile territory. As she talked about these technical details, Sarah's voice regained some of its strength and confidence. The conversation revealed something Emma had not fully understood about Sarah's background. Her expertise in military communications had been as valuable to her team as her combat skills. She had been responsible for maintaining contact with command during their most dangerous missions, often serving as the critical link between her team and the support they needed to survive. This technical expertise represented a part of her identity that might still have value in her new circumstances. Emma listened carefully as Sarah described the various communication systems she had mastered during her SEAL training: radio protocols, satellite communications, emergency signaling devices. Sarah's knowledge was extensive and hard-earned. Emma began to see possibilities that Sarah had not yet considered, ways her expertise could be valuable in training or support roles that would keep her connected to the military community she feared losing. But the most significant moment of their conversation came when Sarah mentioned her security clearance and the classified communication protocols she had used during her most sensitive missions. Emma's expression changed subtly, and Sarah noticed the shift immediately. There was something in Emma's reaction that suggested more than casual interest in the technical details of military communications. Emma hesitated before speaking, clearly wrestling with whether to share something significant. She looked directly at Sarah and asked a question that seemed to come from deep knowledge rather than casual curiosity. She asked about a specific communication protocol used by certain special operations units, mentioning details that should not have been known to a regular Marine infantry soldier. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. The information Emma had referenced was classified at levels that required special clearance and specific operational experience. A regular Marine would not have access to these protocols, and certainly would not mention them casually in conversation. Sarah studied Emma more carefully. Seeing her with new awareness, Emma realized she had revealed more than she intended. Under Sarah's intense scrutiny, she made a decision that would change everything between them. She leaned forward and spoke quietly, as if the walls themselves might be listening. What she revealed made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. Emma was not simply a Marine who had been injured in a routine combat operation. She was a member of a highly classified intelligence unit that operated under civilian cover. Her official records showed her as a regular infantry Marine to protect her actual identity and mission. The injury to her hand had occurred during a covert operation that could never be officially acknowledged. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Emma had been living with the same kind of isolation that Sarah was experiencing, but for very different reasons. While Sarah's isolation came from pride and grief, Emma's had been mandated by the security requirements of her actual position. She could not discuss her real work with medical staff, could not receive recognition for her service, and could not even contact her actual unit for support. Emma explained that her assignment to Walter Reed was not random. Her unit had been concerned about her psychological well-being after her injury, but traditional military counseling was not available due to the classified nature of her work. They had arranged for her to be assigned to the facility's support staff while officially recovering from her own injury, hoping that helping other wounded warriors might provide the therapy she needed. Sarah struggled to process this information. Emma had been providing support and friendship while dealing with her own isolation and loss. The young Marine who had seemed so well-adjusted and positive had been carrying secrets and burdens that Sarah was only beginning to understand. Emma's presence at the facility was not coincidence. It was part of her own healing process. Emma revealed that she had been watching Sarah since her arrival, recognizing in her a kindred spirit struggling with loss of identity and purpose. Emma's unit had taught her to observe and analyze human behavior, skills she had used to understand Sarah's needs better than any medical professional had managed. Her approach had been informed by training as much as empathy. The conversation took on new depth as Emma shared more about her actual background and training. Her expertise in human intelligence gathering had taught her to read people's emotions and motivations with remarkable accuracy. She had recognized immediately that Sarah's isolation came from wounded pride rather than clinical depression, and she had tailored her approach accordingly. Emma explained that her unit's work involved building relationships with assets in hostile environments, often people who had been traumatized or were in desperate circumstances. The skills required for this work, patience, empathy, and the ability to build trust gradually, were exactly what Sarah needed from someone trying to help her heal. Emma had been using her professional training to provide personal support, but Emma's revelation went deeper than just her professional background. She shared that her unit had developed specific protocols for helping their own members cope with injuries and trauma that could not be officially acknowledged. These methods, born from necessity and refined through experience, had proven more effective than traditional military counseling for people in their unique circumstances. Emma offered to share some of these techniques with Sarah, not as therapy or treatment, but as tools developed by and for people who understood the specific challenges of maintaining identity and purpose after life-altering setbacks. These were not clinical interventions, but practical strategies developed by people who had faced similar struggles and found ways to rebuild their lives. Sarah found herself torn between gratitude and anger. Emma had helped her more than anyone else at the facility. but she had done so while concealing her true identity and motivations. The friendship that had been developing between them was now complicated by questions of authenticity and manipulation. Had Emma's kindness been genuine, or had it been part of some larger agenda? Seeing Sarah's confusion and growing suspicion, Emma made another difficult decision. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like an ordinary smartphone but was clearly modified with additional hardware. She explained that this was her only connection to her real unit, the only way she could communicate with people who understood her actual situation. Emma offered to contact her unit commander and request permission to share more details about her assignment and the support protocols they had developed. This would require breaking operational security and potentially compromising her own position, but she was willing to do so if it would help Sarah trust her motives and accept the help she was offering. Sarah stared at the device in Emma's hand, recognizing it as military-grade communications equipment far beyond what a regular Marine would possess. The revelation that Emma was willing to compromise her own security for Sarah's benefit was both touching and disturbing. It suggested that Emma's concern was genuine, but it also raised questions about what her unit might want from Sarah in return. The storm outside was intensifying, and the sound of rain against the window provided a backdrop for the tension building between the two women. Sarah had to decide whether to trust Emma's revelation and accept help that came with complications, or retreat back into the isolation that had protected her but also trapped her. The choice would determine not just her relationship with Emma, but the entire course of her recovery and future. Emma waited patiently as Sarah processed the information she had received. She understood that trust, once broken or complicated, was difficult to rebuild. But she also knew that Sarah was at a critical point in her recovery, and the wrong decision now could send her spiraling back into the despair that had been consuming her before their friendship began. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of thunder and rain. Sarah's analytical mind was working through the implications of Emma's revelation, weighing the risks and benefits of accepting help from someone whose true motivations remained unclear. But her emotional needs were also speaking, reminding her of how much Emma's friendship had already meant to her recovery. Finally, Sarah looked directly at Emma and asked a single question that would determine everything that followed. She wanted to know if Emma's unit was interested in recruiting her for their work, if this entire friendship had been part of an elaborate assessment process. The question hung in the air between them, demanding complete honesty and determining whether their relationship could survive the truth. Emma's answer would either confirm Sarah's worst suspicions about being manipulated, or open the door to possibilities she had not yet imagined. The rookie Marine, who had seemed so innocent and supportive, was about to reveal the full extent of her knowledge about Sarah's background and the real reason she had been assigned to provide help. The secret she had whispered was only the beginning of a revelation that would change both of their lives forever. Emma's answer came without hesitation, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. She looked directly at Sarah and said something that shattered every assumption Sarah had been building about hidden agendas and manipulation. Emma's unit had no interest in recruiting Sarah. In fact, they had specifically instructed Emma not to discuss career opportunities or suggest alternative military roles during their interactions. The truth was more personal and complicated than Sarah had imagined. Emma's unit commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, was herself a former Navy SEAL who had transitioned to intelligence work after a career-ending injury 15 years earlier. When Colonel Hayes learned about Sarah's situation, she had recognized a parallel to her own experience and had quietly arranged for Emma to provide informal support during Sarah's recovery process. Emma explained that Colonel Hayes had gone through her own dark period after her injury, struggling with the same loss of identity and purpose that Sarah was experiencing. There had been no support systems for wounded special operations personnel in those days, no understanding of the unique psychological challenges they faced. Colonel Hayes had nearly lost her life to despair before finding her way to meaningful work in intelligence. The colonel's instructions to Emma had been clear and specific. She was to provide friendship and support without any agenda beyond helping another wounded warrior find her way through the darkest period of her recovery. There would be no recruitment attempts, no suggestions about future career paths, and no pressure to make decisions about her life while she was still processing her trauma and grief. Emma pulled out her secure device and showed Sarah the original message from Colonel Hayes that had initiated her assignment. The text was brief but revealed the depth of concern that had motivated the colonel's intervention. It described Sarah as a decorated warrior who deserved better support than the standard military medical system could provide, and it authorized Emma to use whatever resources were necessary to help her through her recovery. Reading the message, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. This was not about recruitment or manipulation. It was about one wounded warrior reaching out to help another through the darkness. Colonel Hayes had recognized Sarah's situation because she had lived through it herself, and she had sent Emma not to gather intelligence or assess capabilities, but simply to provide human connection during an impossible time. Emma continued her explanation, describing how Colonel Hayes had developed informal support networks for intelligence personnel dealing with trauma and career-ending injuries. These networks operated outside official military channels, providing resources and assistance that traditional systems could not offer to people whose work required maintaining cover identities and security clearances. The protocols Emma had mentioned were not recruitment tools but survival strategies developed by people who had faced similar challenges. They included techniques for rebuilding identity after losing defining roles, methods for finding purpose in circumstances that seemed hopeless, and most importantly, ways to maintain dignity and self-respect while accepting help from others. Sarah asked about Colonel Hayes' current situation, curious about how someone could successfully transition from special operations to intelligence work after a devastating injury. Emma described a remarkable woman who had built a distinguished second career while helping others navigate similar transitions. The Colonel's unit had become known throughout the intelligence community for their success in supporting personnel through difficult circumstances. Emma offered to arrange a conversation between Sarah and Colonel Hayes, not for professional purposes, but simply to provide Sarah with the perspective of someone who had walked a similar path. Colonel Hayes had made it clear that she was available to talk with any wounded warrior who might benefit from hearing her story, regardless of whether they had any interest in intelligence work. The offer intrigued Sarah more than she cared to admit. Throughout her recovery, she had been surrounded by medical professionals and well-meaning supporters, but she had not spoken with anyone who truly understood the specific loss she was experiencing. Colonel Hayes represented something Sarah had not known existed, proof that it was possible to build a meaningful life after losing everything that had defined you as a warrior. But accepting Emma's help still required Sarah to confront her deepest fears about dependence and vulnerability. Her SEAL training had emphasized self-reliance and individual strength, concepts that seemed impossible to reconcile with her current need for assistance and support. Emma seemed to understand this internal struggle without Sarah having to explain it. Emma shared more about her own journey from isolation to acceptance, describing the specific moment when she had realized that accepting help was not the same as admitting weakness. The insight had come during a conversation with a fellow intelligence operative who had been captured and tortured during a mission that went wrong. The operative had explained that survival often required accepting assistance from unexpected sources, and that pride was a luxury that could cost lives in critical situations. The parallel to Sarah's current situation was clear. Just as the operative had needed to trust strangers for survival in hostile territory, Sarah needed to trust others for survival in her current emotional landscape. The skills that had kept her alive in combat, situational awareness, threat assessment, and tactical flexibility, could be adapted to help her navigate the challenges of recovery and rehabilitation. Emma proposed something that surprised Sarah with its simplicity and practicality. Rather than focusing on long-term plans or major life decisions, she suggested that Sarah focus on small, achievable goals that would gradually rebuild her confidence and sense of purpose. These goals could be related to her recovery, her relationships with others at the facility, or simply activities that brought her satisfaction and engagement. The approach Emma described was borrowed from intelligence training, where operatives learned to build networks and gather information through small, consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures. Applied to recovery, this meant celebrating minor victories and building momentum through incremental progress, rather than waiting for breakthrough moments that might never come. Emma suggested that Sarah begin by engaging more actively with her physical therapy, not just completing exercises but taking ownership of her recovery process. She could ask questions about adaptive technologies, research options for increasing her independence, and perhaps even help other patients who were struggling with similar challenges. Each small step would build toward larger goals, without the pressure of making immediate major life decisions. Sarah found herself intrigued by this approach. It offered a way to regain some control over her circumstances without requiring her to abandon her need for independence or accept a completely dependent relationship with others. She could maintain her dignity while still receiving the support she needed to move forward. Emma also suggested that Sarah consider sharing her military expertise in ways that did not require physical capability. Her knowledge of communication systems, tactical planning, and leadership could be valuable to military training programs, defense contractors, or even other wounded warriors who were transitioning to civilian careers. These opportunities would allow her to maintain connection to the military community while exploring new ways to contribute. The conversation continued late into the night with Sarah asking detailed questions about Colonel Hayes' transition and the support networks Emma had described. For the first time since her injury, Sarah was engaging with possibilities for her future rather than simply enduring her present circumstances. The shift was subtle but significant, representing the first crack in the wall of despair that had surrounded her for weeks. Emma made no pressure for immediate decisions or commitments. Instead, she provided information and perspective, allowing Sarah to process the options at her own pace. This approach respected Sarah's need for control while offering genuine alternatives to the isolation and hopelessness she had been experiencing. As their conversation wound down, Sarah made a decision that surprised them both. She asked Emma to stay overnight in her room, not because she needed medical assistance or was afraid to be alone, but because she did not want to return to the isolation that had been consuming her. The request represented a fundamental shift in Sarah's approach to her recovery. Emma agreed immediately, recognizing the significance of Sarah's willingness to accept companionship without practical necessity. They arranged pillows and blankets to make Emma comfortable in the chair beside Sarah's bed, creating an informal arrangement that felt more like a sleepover between friends than a medical accommodation. During the quiet hours before dawn, they talked about topics unrelated to injuries or military service. Emma shared stories about her childhood in New Mexico, her decision to join the Marines, and her dreams of traveling after her military service ended. Sarah talked about books she had read during deployments, places she had seen during her travels, and activities she had enjoyed before her life became entirely focused on military operations. These conversations revealed aspects of their personalities that had been hidden beneath their military identities. Sarah discovered that Emma was an accomplished artist who sketched portraits during her spare time. Emma learned that Sarah was fluent in 3 languages and had considered becoming a translator before joining the Navy. These hidden talents and interests suggested possibilities for their futures that neither had previously considered. As morning approached, both women felt something had changed in their relationship and in their individual perspectives on recovery. The trust that had been building between them had deepened into genuine friendship, and the support Emma offered was no longer complicated by questions about hidden agendas or ulterior motives. Sarah had found someone who understood her situation without judging her response to it. The dawn light filtering through the hospital window illuminated 2 women who had both been wounded by their service but were beginning to find ways to heal together. Emma's secret had been revealed not as a betrayal but as an unexpected gift, the knowledge that others had walked this path before and had found ways to build meaningful lives on the other side of devastation. Sarah's decision to accept Emma's friendship represented more than just overcoming isolation. It was the beginning of her journey back to trusting others, accepting help when needed, and imagining a future that might be different from what she had planned, but could still be worthwhile and fulfilling. The foundation they had built through honest conversation and shared vulnerability would become the launching pad for Sarah's re-engagement with life. But the most challenging test of their friendship was still ahead, the moment when Sarah would need to decide whether to remain safely within the walls of the rehabilitation facility or venture back into a world that would require her to be vulnerable in ways her training had never prepared her to handle. Emma's presence had given Sarah the courage to consider that possibility, but the actual step of leaving the protected environment of Walter Reed would require a different kind of strength than either of them had yet discovered. The bridge of trust they had built between themselves would need to be extended to include others who had not earned it through shared experience and mutual understanding. The morning brought new challenges and opportunities, but for the first time since her injury, Sarah would face them with the knowledge that she was not alone. Emma's friendship had become more than just emotional support. It was proof that meaningful connections were possible, even in the most difficult circumstances, and that accepting help from others could increase rather than diminish her strength and resilience. The secret Emma had whispered in the darkness had become the foundation for a friendship that would sustain them both through the challenges ahead. As they prepared to face another day of rehabilitation and recovery, both women carried with them the knowledge that they had found something rare and valuable, a connection built on truth, trust, and mutual respect that could weather whatever storms lay ahead. Their journey together was just beginning, but the direction was now clear. They would move forward not as wounded warriors carrying their burdens alone, but as friends supporting each other through the complex process of rebuilding their lives and discovering new sources of purpose and meaning in circumstances they had never imagined possible. 3 months after Emma's revelation, Sarah wheeled herself through the corridors of Walter Reed with a purpose she had not felt since before her injury. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. Where once she had moved through the facility like a ghost trying to avoid contact, she now navigated with the confidence of someone who belonged to the community around her. The change had begun with small steps that Emma had suggested during their late-night conversations. Sarah had started attending group physical therapy sessions instead of insisting on individual treatment. She had joined other patients in the dining facility rather than eating alone in her room. Most significantly, she had begun offering assistance to newer patients who were struggling with their own transitions from active duty to rehabilitation. Dr. Patricia Kovachob had noticed the transformation immediately. During their weekly counseling sessions, Sarah was no longer the withdrawn, angry patient who had arrived months earlier. She asked questions about adaptive technologies, discussed plans for independent living, and most remarkably, expressed interest in helping other wounded warriors navigate their recovery process. The psychologist recognized that Sarah had found something that formal therapy had been unable to provide: a sense of purpose that connected to her military identity while acknowledging her new circumstances. Captain Jennifer Walsh had watched Sarah's physical progress accelerate as her emotional healing advanced. The mechanical compliance Sarah had shown during early therapy sessions had evolved into genuine engagement with her rehabilitation. She pushed herself harder during exercises, asked detailed questions about adaptive techniques, and demonstrated the kind of determination that had made her an elite operator. But now that determination was focused on rebuilding, rather than simply enduring. The conversation that would define Sarah's future came during a visit from Colonel Patricia Hayes, Emma's unit commander. Emma had arranged the meeting after weeks of preparation, ensuring that Sarah was ready for the conversation, and that Colonel Hayes understood the delicate nature of the situation. The colonel arrived at Walter Reed not in uniform but in civilian clothes, maintaining the cover that protected her unit's operations. Colonel Hayes was a woman in her early 50s, whose bearing immediately revealed her military background, despite her civilian attire, the confidence in her movements, the direct way she made eye contact, and the precise manner of her speech. All spoke of years in special operations. But what struck Sarah most was the presence of someone who had successfully navigated the transition she was still struggling to imagine. Their conversation began in Sarah's room but quickly moved to a private conference room where they could speak more freely. Colonel Hayes shared her own story of injury and recovery, describing the despair and anger she had experienced when her SEAL career ended abruptly. But she also described the discovery that her military skills and experience could be valuable in intelligence work, and how that realization had provided a path back to meaningful service. The colonel explained that the intelligence community had gradually recognized the value of personnel with special operations backgrounds. The skills that made someone an effective SEAL or Marine: situational awareness, ability to work under pressure, expertise in foreign cultures and languages, were directly applicable to intelligence gathering and analysis. But the transition required reframing those skills for a different kind of mission. Sarah listened with growing interest as Colonel Hayes described the evolution of her second career. The work was different from special operations, but equally challenging and important. Instead of direct action missions, she planned operations that prevented conflicts from escalating. Instead of eliminating threats through force, she gathered information that allowed policymakers to make informed decisions. The mission had changed, but the sense of serving something larger than herself had remained constant. Colonel Hayes was careful to emphasize that she was not recruiting Sarah or suggesting any specific career path. The intelligence community had strict policies about approaching wounded personnel during their recovery period, and she was scrupulous about respecting those boundaries. But she was willing to share information about opportunities that might become available when Sarah was ready to consider her future options. The conversation revealed possibilities Sarah had not imagined. Her expertise in military communications could be valuable in developing secure communication systems for intelligence operations. Her language skills could support operations in regions where she had previously deployed. Her leadership experience could be useful in training programs for new intelligence personnel. Each possibility represented a way to maintain connection to national service while adapting to her physical limitations. Colonel Hayes also described the support networks that existed within the intelligence community for personnel dealing with disabilities and career transitions. These informal systems provided mentorship, practical assistance, and emotional support that complemented official military medical care. They had been developed by people who understood the unique challenges faced by wounded warriors transitioning to civilian roles. But the most important part of their conversation focused not on career opportunities, but on the process of rebuilding identity and purpose after devastating loss. Colonel Hayes described the specific challenges she had faced in learning to see herself as valuable despite her physical limitations. She talked about the importance of maintaining connections to military culture while developing new sources of self-worth and accomplishment. The colonel emphasized that recovery was not about returning to who you had been before injury, but about discovering who you could become afterward. This required accepting that some changes were permanent while remaining open to possibilities that had not previously existed. The process was difficult and ongoing, but it could lead to a life that was different from what had been planned but equally meaningful. Sarah found herself asking detailed questions about the practical aspects of Colonel Hayes' transition. How had she maintained her security clearance while dealing with medical issues? How had she learned new skills while processing the grief of her lost career? How had she built relationships with new colleagues who had not shared her military experiences? Each question reflected Sarah's growing willingness to consider possibilities beyond her current circumstances. Colonel Hayes answered each question thoroughly, describing both the challenges and rewards of her career transition. She was honest about the difficulties, the periods of doubt, the frustration with physical limitations, the ongoing process of proving herself in a new field. But she also described the satisfaction of work that utilized her skills in new ways and the fulfillment that came from mentoring others through similar transitions. As their conversation continued, Sarah realized that Colonel Hayes was offering her something more valuable than career advice or professional opportunities. She was providing proof that it was possible to build a meaningful life after losing everything that had previously defined you. The Colonel's success was not about overcoming her disability or pretending it did not matter, but about finding ways to contribute despite her limitations. The meeting concluded with Colonel Hayes providing Sarah with contact information for several organizations that supported wounded warriors in career transitions. She emphasized that Sarah should take whatever time she needed for recovery and reflection before making any major decisions. The opportunities would still be available when she was ready to pursue them, and rushing into new commitments during the recovery process could be counterproductive. After Colonel Hayes left, Sarah sat in her room processing everything she had learned. For the first time since her injury, she could envision a future that extended beyond basic survival and adaptation. The conversation had not eliminated her grief over her lost career, but it had provided hope that meaningful work and purpose were still possible in her changed circumstances. Emma found Sarah later that evening, eager to hear about her conversation with Colonel Hayes. Sarah described the meeting in detail, expressing both excitement about the possibilities that had been presented and anxiety about the challenges involved in pursuing them. Emma listened with the patient attention that had become characteristic of their friendship, offering support without trying to influence Sarah's decisions. Their conversation that night marked another milestone in Sarah's recovery. She began talking about specific goals beyond her rehabilitation, places she wanted to visit, skills she wanted to develop, contributions she hoped to make. These aspirations were tentative and subject to change, but they represented a fundamental shift from survival mode to active engagement with her future possibilities. Over the following weeks, Sarah began taking steps toward greater independence and self-determination. She researched adaptive technologies that could increase her mobility and functionality. She reached out to former colleagues to maintain professional relationships that might be valuable in future career transitions. Most importantly, she began volunteering with newer patients at Walter Reed, sharing her experience and providing the kind of support she had received from Emma. Sarah's volunteer work revealed talents she had not previously recognized. Her ability to connect with wounded warriors struggling with despair and anger was remarkable. She could speak to their experiences with the credibility of someone who had walked the same path, and her progress provided hope for others who were earlier in their recovery process. Medical staff began asking for her assistance with particularly challenging patients. The success of her volunteer work gave Sarah confidence to consider more formal roles in supporting wounded warriors. She began researching organizations that provided services to veterans transitioning from military to civilian life. Her combination of military experience, personal understanding of recovery challenges, and emerging skills in peer counseling created a unique profile that several organizations found intriguing. Emma watched Sarah's transformation with pride and satisfaction. Her friend had evolved from a broken warrior refusing help to someone actively seeking ways to help others. The change validated Emma's decision to share her secret and invest time and emotional energy in Sarah's recovery. Their friendship had become mutually supportive, with each woman drawing strength from their connection. As Sarah's discharge from Walter Reed approached, she faced decisions that would determine the direction of her post-military life. She could pursue opportunities in the intelligence community that Colonel Hayes had described. She could focus on work with veterans organizations helping other wounded warriors. She could explore completely different career paths that utilized her skills in new ways. Each option represented possibilities she could not have imagined during her darkest periods at the facility. The night before her discharge, Sarah and Emma sat together in the recreation room where they had had their first extended conversation months earlier. The space looked the same, but everything else had changed. Sarah was no longer the angry, isolated patient who had rejected all offers of help. Emma was no longer the mysterious young Marine whose true identity and motivations were unclear. They had become genuine friends whose connection transcended their initial circumstances. Sarah thanked Emma for the courage she had shown in sharing her secret and the patience she had demonstrated during Sarah's most difficult periods. Emma expressed gratitude for the privilege of witnessing Sarah's recovery and for the friendship that had helped her process her own challenges. They acknowledged that their paths would likely diverge as they pursued different opportunities, but they committed to maintaining their connection regardless of geographic distance or career demands. The morning of Sarah's discharge was both celebratory and emotional. Medical staff who had worked with her during her recovery gathered to wish her well and express their admiration for her progress. Fellow patients thanked her for the support and encouragement she had provided during their own difficult moments. The community that Sarah had initially rejected had become a source of strength and purpose. As Sarah prepared to leave Walter Reed, she carried with her more than just medical clearances and rehabilitation certifications. She had rebuilt her identity around new definitions of strength and service. She had learned to accept help from others without sacrificing her dignity or independence. Most importantly, she had discovered that meaningful purpose was possible, even when life took unexpected and unwanted directions. Emma accompanied Sarah to the facility's main entrance, where a specially equipped vehicle waited to transport her to her new apartment. The moment represented not just Sarah's discharge from medical care, but her transition from patient to independent person, ready to engage with whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. They embraced briefly, a gesture that would have been impossible for Sarah just months earlier. 6 months later, Sarah was working for a veterans organization that provided peer counseling and support services to wounded warriors. Her office was in a building that had been designed for accessibility, and her work involved helping other veterans navigate the same transition process she had experienced. The career was different from anything she had previously imagined, but it provided the sense of mission and purpose that had always driven her. Emma had accepted a position with an intelligence unit that allowed her to use her cover identity more openly while supporting operations in areas where her language skills were valuable. The friends maintained regular contact, sharing updates about their work and personal lives. Their friendship had become a source of stability and perspective as they built new lives from the foundation of their shared experience at Walter Reed. Sarah's story had become one of transformation rather than just survival. The injury that had initially seemed to end everything meaningful in her life had become the catalyst for discovering new sources of purpose and fulfillment. The help she had initially refused had become the foundation for helping others through similar challenges. The secret Emma had whispered during Sarah's darkest hour had opened the door to possibilities neither of them had imagined. What began as one wounded warrior helping another had evolved into a friendship that sustained them both through the complex process of rebuilding their lives after devastating change. Their story demonstrated that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from individual resilience, but from the courage to accept help from others and the wisdom to offer that help when it is needed most. The mission that had defined Sarah's identity had changed, but the core values that had made her an effective warrior, courage, determination, and commitment to something larger than herself, remained constant. She had learned that adapting to change was not a sign of weakness but another form of strength, and that accepting help from others could increase rather than diminish her ability to serve and contribute. In the end, Sarah's refusal to accept help had been overcome not through argument or pressure, but through the patient friendship of someone who understood her struggle and was willing to share her own vulnerability to create a bridge of trust and understanding. The rookie Marine's whispered secret had become the foundation for both women's recovery and growth, proving that sometimes the most unlikely connections can provide the strength needed to survive and thrive in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges.